If you have been made bankrupt, how can you get out of bankruptcy without serving a full 3-year term? Now, there is a way. Hi everyone, Liam Bailey here from O'Brien Palmer. Over the last 2 weeks we've been talking about personal insolvency and ways to avoid bankruptcy. Specifically, what's been driving the recent spike in personal insolvency events and how personal insolvency agreements can be a tool to avoid the necessity of becoming bankrupt. Today we're going to talk about what happens if bankruptcy is unavoidable. So you'll find some links below to our previous discussions in relation to what happens if you are bankrupt and the other previous topics that we talked about. If you have been made bankrupt, how can you get out of bankruptcy without serving a full 3-year term? Now, there is a way. Section 73 of the Bankruptcy Act allows a debtor to put a proposal to their creditors to have their bankruptcy annulled and therefore be discharged from bankruptcy early. It's a very similar process to that which I described last week when we were talking about personal insolvency agreements. Again, the debtor outlines the assets that they have that would be subject to a composition, which would set out the terms on which those assets are dealt with and realised and then paid out to creditors. It can also involve contributions coming in from future income, which may increase if the debtor is released from bankruptcy, or injection of funds from a third party, such as a loan from a family member or other external source. The idea being is that the annulment composition will provide a better or more timely return to the creditors of the bankrupt estate than they would receive if the bankruptcy were to run for the full term. Once again, like in a personal insolvency agreement, it needs to be approved by 50% by number and 75% in value of the participating creditors. However, annulment compositions have a significantly higher rate of success than personal insolvency agreements. Considering that they are a virtually identical process and may result in similar outcomes to the personal insolvency agreement process, we have to question, why is it that people will be more likely to support the annulment and early discharge of a debtor from bankruptcy, but not have been willing to consider a personal insolvency agreement that would have resulted in avoiding the debtor from becoming bankrupt in the first place? I think there's a number of reasons. First and foremost, bankruptcy is not intended to be a punishment of a debtor. The bankruptcy system considers itself to be rehabilitative. That is, it helps people who are encumbered by crippling debt that they can't afford to pay from turning their lives around and escaping the cycle of debt so that they can start afresh. However, for creditors of an individual who has been forced to go bankrupt, there is somewhat of a justice or punishment type aspect where they consider that there has been a justice served or a disincentive incurred by the debtor if they've been forced to become bankrupt. And so once that person's become bankrupt, the anger or the emotion of the debtor who's been unable to be paid often fades away, allowing people to consider the issue on a far more financial or rational basis. Another aspect that is highly relevant is the fact that in bankruptcy, the bankruptcy trustee has a much longer period of time to investigate the affairs of the debtor and far greater and broader powers to conduct independent investigations that mean that by the time a report is prepared to go to creditors, outlining the terms of an annulment composition and the comparison of outcomes if the bankruptcy were to run full to term, the bankruptcy trustee is able to make far more reliable determinations about the circumstances of the debtor and the outcomes for creditors, and therefore what is in creditors' interest to accept in relation to the composition arrangement or allowing a person to remain in bankruptcy for full term. For all of these things mean that a bankruptcy trustee is far better positioned to conduct all of the necessary inquiries, communicate with creditors, and provide greater certainty of outcomes for creditors. The process is, again, not dissimilar in that a debtor needs to come up with the funds from potentially a third-party source to cover the associated costs with putting an annulment composition to creditors. It is not considered appropriate that the assets of the debtor that are vested in a bankruptcy trustee be applied to the cost of a bankrupt escaping from bankruptcy or being released from bankruptcy early. It may only cost, however, $10,000 to put up an annulment proposal as opposed to maybe $25,000 in a controlling trusteeship, because a large amount of the investigation work will have already been completed in the bankruptcy. So there's far less risk associated with putting forward an unsuccessful annulment composition than there is in putting forward a personal insolvency agreement. However, what it does mean is we do come up with some rather unusual outcomes. In a recent matter that we administered here at O'Brien Palmer, a debtor came forward and sought to put forward a personal insolvency agreement in which they offered 20 cents in the dollar to all creditors payable within 1 month of execution of the personal insolvency agreement. Creditors came together and voted and rejected the personal insolvency agreement. Debtor then presented a petition for their bankruptcy, and we were appointed as trustees in bankruptcy. 4 months later, that same debtor put forward an annulment composition for 10 cents in the dollar to creditors, payable in 3 months from approval from creditors, and this time creditors voted to accept it. That means that in rejecting the personal insolvency agreement, but ultimately accepting the annulment composition, creditors received half of the return that they might have achieved if they had thought rationally about and accepted the personal insolvency agreement in the first place. It therefore cannot be so understated that understanding the motivations of creditors when considering personal insolvency agreements and bankruptcy needs to be taken into account and is highly relevant in making any decisions about moving forward into bankruptcy with a view to seeking an ultimate annulment, or whether to go down the pathway of a personal insolvency agreement. Annulment of bankruptcy is obviously in a debtor's interest. It allows them to repair their credit ratings in a much faster fashion. An annulment will not remove the fact that you were made bankrupt from the National Personal Insolvency Index, nor will it remove it from any of the credit rating files. However, it will certainly look better on any of your credit rating files to note that the bankruptcy did not go all 3 years and was discharged automatically at the exclusion period, but resulted in an annulment and therefore an agreed compromise arrangement with your creditors. All these things do definitely look better, as well as allowing the debtor to get back out into the community and start rehabilitating their own personal financial affairs, and significantly has the prospects of providing a better outcome for creditors than leaving a bankrupt in bankruptcy for 3 years. So creditors should be encouraged to look at both personal insolvency agreements and annulment compositions that are put to them in light of their own financial interests, and not to be bound by making emotional decisions or some idea that a debtor needs to be punished. A pleasing development in a recent matter that we had at O'Brien Palmer. 2 individuals became bankrupt as a result of the personal guarantees that they'd issued for finance of a business that had failed and gone into liquidation. The director and the director's mother. The director's mother was 78 years old and had signed on as personal guarantor to her son's debts and offered her home as security. The finances had moved on the mother's home and forced her into bankruptcy for the shortfall. A number of family members had come to the party and offered an injection of capital because they felt that it was unfair for their mother, who was 78 years old, was never going to pay income contributions to her estate, had no assets left to be realised, to serve a period of bankruptcy in her older age. And so they came to the party and they put forward $50,000 and offered that to creditors in order to have their mother discharged early from bankruptcy. Creditors accepted that there was no prospects of a dividend in the mother remaining in bankruptcy. They accepted the $50,000, resulting in a 4 cent in the dollar return, and the mother was discharged from bankruptcy only 3 months into the term of her bankruptcy. So these are the sorts of circumstances that annulment can be favourably achieved, and they can also be achieved for any debtor who finds themselves in a position where they might be able to finally offer something better to their creditors than would otherwise be obtained, and to get out of bankruptcy early. If this is you, if you don't think there's any possibility for you to negotiate your way out and avoid bankruptcy by direct negotiations or through a personal insolvency agreement, have a chat with us today. We can administer the bankrupt estate in a way that allows us to conduct investigations with a view to putting forward annulment compositions that will be interesting to creditors if you're going to find yourself in a position down the track to offer something. Talk to us today. We're happy to have a chat with you about your circumstances. I hope this information and the information we provided over the last few weeks and in all the links below is being useful. As we said in our previous presentations, bankruptcy is not the end and it's not the worst thing that could ever happen to you. Please don't be intimidated. Give us a call today. We can get you realistic information about how it will impact your life and how we can help deal with your circumstances and start your turnaround today. Speak with you soon.